Good morning, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode 175, looking at stories from Dornoch. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Wick, Fort William and Portree. Together they care for the historic documents from the Highlands of Scotland. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that, and there's a link to be able to do that within the text, whether you're watching on Facebook or whether you're watching on YouTube. And this week we are continuing my somewhat intermittent series of looking at some of the main settlements, particularly those with historic connections in the Highlands and Islands, and this week we are looking at Dornoch. I said last week that I was fully expecting this week's Learn with Lorna to be live, but it actually can't be, as I'm welcoming some pupils from Aldowrie Primary School to the Highland Archive Centre. They're celebrating their 150th anniversary this week, so I'm with them instead of with you, so forgive me that it's pre-recorded again. I've looked ahead and I think all of March's are looking clear so far, although it is a very busy month in various other ways, and I'll talk about that at a later date. So this week we are looking at Dornoch, as I say, which has been the site of loads of interesting stories. Let's start, first of all, as always, by locating ourselves. I'm aware some of you will be very familiar with this and some of you may well be in Dornoch, but some may never have come across it. So Dornoch was a royal borough, the former county town of the county of Sutherland, and the borough of Dornoch sits within the parish of Dornoch and then, as I say, the county of Sutherland. It sits on the east coast of the county, on the north shore of the Dornoch Firth, just across the Firth from Tain, which we've talked about previously. It's around 45 miles north of Inverness by road and around 62 miles south of Wick, so somewhere in between those two. There's evidence of early settlement in and around Dornoch, cairns and kists and other archaeological finds that suggest that people lived in and around or passed through this area from anywhere from around 5000 BC onwards. And I found it really interesting when I was looking at this, and I will point you now to the History Links website, which I will come back and talk about later on. History Links is a museum and heritage site in Dornoch, and I was having a look at their website that referenced some of these early evidence of settlements, archaeological finds and so on. And so I went then to look on the Ordnance Survey maps and in the Ordnance Survey name books to see what I could find about them, and I was absolutely amazed to look through those name books to see the sheer number of tumuli, of chambered cairns, hut circles and other sites across the area. And as I say, if you're interested in finding out more about that, do go and have a look at the History Links website, and actually in the History Links building where they have some great information about the archaeological research that's been done in the area. But obviously my take on where I can get information on archaeology is limited to things like the maps, the name books and so on. And to find out when Dornoch really started to become a significant place, or at least when we have evidence of it being a significant place, we need to come forward in time quite a lot, to around about the 1200s, which was a really important period in the history of Dornoch. And this is how the first statistical account explains the way in which Dornoch came by its name. Origin of the name. The town and parish of Dornoch derive their name from the Gaelic words Dornach, which signifies a horse's foot or hoof, concerning which the current tradition is as follows. About the year 1259, the Danes and Norwegians, having made a descent on this coast, were attacked by William, Thane or Earl of Sutherland, a quarter of a mile to the eastward of this town. Here the Danish general was slain and his army beaten and forced to retire to their ships, which were not far distant. The Thane of Sutherland greatly signalised himself on this occasion, and appears by his personal valour and exertion to have contributed very much to determine the fate of that day. While he singled out the Danish general and gallantly fought his way onward, the Thane, being by some accident disarmed, seized the leg of a horse which lay on the ground, and with that dispatched his adversary. In honour of this exploit and of the weapon with which it was achieved, this place received the name Dornoch, or Dornoch as it is now called. This tradition is countenanced by the horseshoe, which is still retained in the arms of the borough. In memory of the event, a stone pillar was erected on the spot, supporting at the top a cross, encompassed by a circle, which went under the name of the Earl's Cross. Standing on a sandy hillock, it was gradually undermined by the winds. Several years ago, it tumbled down and was broken to pieces. At present, only scattered fragments of it remain. But I have to say, it is standing again, because I had a look. The Vikings' time here is also evidenced through other in other ways. So we can see it witnessed by place names, which retain those distinct Norse derivations. If you remember, when we did the episode on place names, we looked at places that had Gaelic derivation, places that had Norse, and so on. And in around the area of Dornoch are various places like Embo, which include that very distinct Norse ending. But another thing that was happening in Dornoch around about the same time was the founding of Dornoch Cathedral. We hold various items which tell the story of the cathedral, and this extract is from one of those, A Brief History of Dornoch Cathedral by Ian Ross Harper. Gilbert de Moravia, or Gilbert Murray, who was related to the powerful Earl of Murray, became Bishop of Caithness in 1224. His diocese covered the modern counties of Caithness and Sutherland. He was a rich, well-educated man, a courtier and a diplomat who had travelled widely on the king's behalf. He was thus well acquainted with the magnificent cathedrals to be found all over Europe. He decided to move the seat of the diocese from Falkirk in the north to Dornoch in the far south. Among the reasons for this change were firstly, the murderous treatment meted out to his predecessors, secondly, the fact that he owned the coastal strip of land on which Dornoch stood, and thirdly, that in Dornoch he would be close to his near relative, the newly created Earl of Sutherland, who had taken up residence in Golspie and who would be able to help him in times of danger. In 1224, Bishop Gilbert started work on the cathedral at his own expense. Sir Robert Gordon, the first Sutherland historian, tells us that he used local stone and glass from Cider Hall. He began in the centre of the building with the 4 great pillars or piers, which are roughly 3 feet 6 inches square in section. The cathedral walls join them on 2 sides, while 3 partly engaged shafts rise on each of the other 2 sides. The piers are 27 feet high at the capitals, and the arches rise from the capitals to a height of 47 feet. The piers are not quite uniform in height or spacing, so that the outer orders of the arches do not meet up accurately except at the southeast pier. The piers and arches were all built in the transitional style, and they are original, except for a little cosmetic work here and there. As the piers began to rise, Bishop Gilbert would have commenced work on the chancel, the transepts, and eventually the tower. And Bishop Gilbert, when he started to construct this cathedral, gave it a constitution which not only had a remit for education in it, and I'll come back to that, but also stipulated that it would need to have 10 canons, and there would be a dean who would look after the administration, a precentor who would be responsible for music, a chancellor who had literary responsibilities, a treasurer for the finances, and an archdeacon who oversaw the well-being of all the churches within the area they were responsible for. So we start to have evidence of Dingwall as a place of importance, a notable religious site. And of course, as I mentioned, it's just opposite across the Dornoch Firth from Tain, which, if you remember from the episode on Tain, was a really important religious site in across centuries as well. And the cathedral seemed to hold its own until, well, with ups and downs, of course, until this happened. In 1567, the cathedral was burnt by marauding clansmen, but a much more serious incident occurred in 1570, after the young teenage Earl of Sutherland was rescued from the clutches of his enemy, the Earl of Caithness, by the men of Dornoch. The Earl was furious, and he determined to teach Dornoch a lesson. He sent a large force of men to attack the borough. They were supported by Mackay of Strathnaver and his men, and by Sutherland of Duffus and his brother William and their men. Being vastly outnumbered, the Murrays of Dornoch were rapidly overwhelmed, and the Earl of Caithness had his revenge as his men sacked the borough, desecrated the tomb of St Gilbert, and burnt the cathedral so thoroughly that the entire roof fell in, and the building was left as a blackened ruin. And it would remain in that state for around 50 years. And that's just one episode in the cathedral's tumultuous history, like so many religious institutions. We hold charters from the 1500s and 1600s which give Dornoch as the place of signing, or which mention Dornoch as a place that witnesses have come from. So by now, we know that it's a significant settlement and it's a place where decisions are being recorded. And so you might be thinking that it's a royal borough by now, because after all, Dingwall was a royal borough from the 1200s, Inverness from the 1100s, Tain reputedly from the 1000s. It's a place of religion and therefore a place of learning, and so you might think by now it's a royal borough. But it actually wasn't until 1628 that Dornoch received its royal charter from King Charles I, becoming a royal borough. And as with so many other places, it's as we move into the 1600s, 1700s, that the number of records start to increase substantially. And you will have heard me mention that so many times before over the different episodes, that earlier years can be piecing together of bits of information, evidence from maps, archaeology, which of course I don't really deal with. But as we start to come into these 16, 17, 1800s, we're able to look across many more record types from things like borough minutes, church records, and so on. And this is exactly the case with the Dornoch records. As we come into the 1700s, there's almost an immediate change. We have Dornoch Presbytery minutes from 1707 onwards, Dornoch Kirk Session from 1715 onwards. By now, the cathedral, having started as Roman Catholic, the cathedral becomes a Presbyterian and then a Church of Scotland building. We have Town Council minutes for Dornoch from 1729 onwards. And this ties in really well, this kind of flourishing of documentary evidence, with a really interesting period of some fascinating stories from Dornoch's history. I've spoken many times before about the Jacobite risings, and they played out across the whole country, and Dornoch is no exception. And I'm not going to go into the history of the risings here because I've looked at it, as I say, so many times before. But my quickest way to share just one example of how Sutherland was impacted by the Jacobite risings. I wrote an article a few years ago for the History Links blog about some of the ways in which the 1715 rising particularly impacted Easter Ross and Sutherland. And within that, I included an incredible quote from the Dornoch Presbytery minutes. So I thought rather than trying to reword that all, I'll just read to you from an article that I wrote a few years ago. The 15 was largely fought in the Lowlands and England. However, events in Easter Ross were perhaps decisive. There was a notable standoff between the Earl of Sutherland and the Earl of Seaforth. Sutherland had returned to Dunrobin Castle on the 28th of September 1715 to take up his role as Supreme Commander of Loyalist forces in the north. He immediately mustered Hanoverian supporters to march south. By the 5th of October they had reached Alness, where they were joined by supporters to march south. By the 5th of October they reached Alness, where they were joined by Rosses, Munros and Mackays. This combined force would attempt to prevent Seaforth's Jacobites from marching to support a garrison which had seized Inverness. However, Seaforth's Mackenzies were soon reinforced by a force of around 3,000 to 4,000 MacDonalds, MacLeods and McKinnons, and they marched on the Earl of Sutherland's men. Around the 9th of October, they passed the heights of Fodderty and Bray before marching through Sordale and Glenglass and forcing Sutherland's men to retreat. So although this is happening out with the Dornoch area, the fact that the Earl of Sutherland is one of the key movers here obviously has an impact. This skirmish and detours to raid the houses of Hanoverian supporters such as Munro Fowles delayed the Earl of Seaforth to such an extent that he was 2 months late taking his Jacobites to support Mar's main army, and that likely contributed to the failure of the rising. And the 1715 rising kind of drew to a final conclusion across that autumn-winter of 1715, October-November time. Battle of Sheriff Muir was inconclusive but halted the Jacobites' advance. The Battle of Preston was a disastrous loss for the Jacobites. And that incident that had happened in and around Sutherland and Ross and Cromarty was part of this general failure of the rising. I've said before that the 15 is now often overshadowed by the 45, but it's interesting to me to look at Dornoch Presbytery Minute Book for January 1716 and see what the church was considering the situation to be at this point. The Presbytery of Dornoch, taking to their serious consideration the tokens of God's displeasure against this land, which are evident by an unnatural rebellion raised in it by a popish and Jacobite malignant faction in favour of a popish pretender, in occasioning an intestine or civil war in this our native land, which has raged now for a considerable time, and continues the evil that it has produced, and still threatens to our holy religion and civil liberties. There is a probability of its leaving our land desolate and a field of blood, if not suppressed. We look upon it as a judicial stroke from God upon the land for the abounding sins thereof. So as I say, these events are not happening in Dornoch, but they are happening under the control of the Earl of Sutherland's men, the Earl of Seaforth's men, and there is not a community in between that wouldn't have been caught up in that. And the fact that the Presbytery of Dornoch came together to write that summary of what they thought this meant for the country, that particularly chilling last sentence around there is a prediction that Scotland will become desolate and a field of blood, was obviously exactly what went on to happen at the Battle of Culloden 30 years later. But in the 45, which of course culminated in the Battle of Culloden, we also see Dornoch seeing action. Hundreds of Jacobites arrived into the area, which was, because of the Earl of Sutherland, there was an understanding that many were leaning towards government support, or in name at least. And that history of the cathedral, which I read out previously, it also includes another extract which records the devastating impact that the 45 had on Dornoch. A third disaster to the cathedral, occurred during the rebellion of 1745-46, when Dornoch was occupied first by the King's army and then by the Jacobites. Much damage was done to the principal buildings of the borough, and once more, it is said, men and horses were stabled in the cathedral. By 1769, it was in a ruinous condition again, and in 1772-75, it was repaired and re-roofed for the third time. The borough received a grant of £300 from the Exchequer towards the cost of repair work. This very unusual and surprising grant lends credence to the view that the cathedral was badly damaged during the 45, and that the grant was a form of war reparations. But in between the 15 and the 45, and not connected to the Jacobites at all, Dornoch was witness to another extraordinary and horrific event. The last burning of a witch in Britain happened in Dornoch. It happened, we think, in 1727. There is a memorial stone in Dornoch which marks it as 1722, but I think that generally now is contested and understood to be 1727. And the Ordnance Survey name book, so the Ordnance Survey maps show the location of the last burning of the witch, and then the Ordnance Survey name book records the entry like this. The stone, it's stone that says witch burned here. The stone which marks the spot where this event took place stands in a garden in front of the eastmost house of a little town. The date of the occurrence is marked on the stone as 1722, and the following extract regarding it is taken from the old statistical account. Not far from the Earl's Cross previously mentioned is the spot where an unhappy creature was burned in 1722 for the imaginary crime of witchcraft, for transforming her daughter into a pony and getting her shod by the devil. This was the last instance of these frantic executions in the north of Scotland. And I've looked at various descriptions of that event, and it seems that Janet Horn, who was the witch who was burnt, she's often described as being in her dotage or being an old grandmother, and it seems like she may have been suffering from something like dementia, because she sat warming her hands by the fire, chatting contentedly to onlookers before she was burnt in a barrel of oil. And the daughter whose hands and feet she is supposed to have had shod by the devil, it seems that she probably just had some sort of physical deformity, as did other members of the family. It's a brutal story, it's a distressing story, and the Witchcraft Act would be repealed in Scotland only a few years later in 1735. So had Janet Horne existed 20 or 30 years later, it is unlikely that she would have had the same treatment. Likely that the story would have been very different. Moving from the 18th into the 19th century, we see huge changes in the treatment of the elderly, people suffering from either mental illness, physical illness, weakness, crisis, debility. We start to see a huge change in how people were treated. There's some examples of funds being set up to deal with immediate crisis. So I've spoken previously about the Meikle Ferry disaster, and that impacted, of course, going as it did between Tain and Dornoch, impacted the community of Dornoch in 1809. But for general support of people who were struggling in some way, it was the Poor Law Scotland Act of 1845 that saw control of financial and practical support for the poor and the weak pass from the church to the newly created parochial boards. And we hold a good series of these records for Dornoch, including applications for relief, minute books and general registers for poor. And even in the first few pages of the applications, I found some interesting cases. So for instance, in 1899, 73-year-old Betsy Forbes, a lodging housekeeper who applied for help as her husband had died a year earlier and she was partially destitute. Her entry notes why her children couldn't be of any more help to her. William, aged 47, was now in Australia. Marion, aged 42, was now in America. George, aged 32, was now in America. Barbara, aged 34, was in Glasgow. And it is noted in a subsequent document that Barbara did pay the rent for her mother. And that story, which I'm not going to go into here, but that story of emigration, of movement, of clearance, of people leaving Dornoch and Sutherland in general for other parts of the world is, of course, it's a huge part of Sutherland's history. And that's all happening at this period as well, with people leaving the area. And that's mentioned in the statistical accounts, the fact that he records the population and then says it would be higher had so many people not recently left. Going back to Betsy Forbes, she was given the option of going into the poorhouse, but she refused it. And we see the same in other entries. Just turning a few pages, I saw other people offered poorhouse ticket but refused. The poorhouse was not an option that anybody would have taken lightly. These volumes record the treatment of the elderly, the insane, as people are tagged, the exhausted, the infirm, the injured, again, the weak. They record stories of men, women and children, and people of all ages, including young Donald Taylor. I found this story within a minute book. The inspector read to the meeting 2 letters from Mr. Alexander Matheson, Taylor in Dornoch, dated respectively the 27th and the 22nd and the 27th of January current. This is 1890. Relative to a boy, Donald Taylor, whom Matheson has maintained for the past 2 months, but declines to do so any longer. The letters are as follows. 1. I have accommodated Donald Taylor, the late Reverend Mr. Taylor's nephew, for the past 2 months, but I don't consider it my duty to accommodate him longer. Provision, however, must be made for him, which devolves either on his relatives or on the parochial board. The latter is bound, meantime, to make some provision, and I write to you in the hope that you will interest yourself immediately on his behalf. The second letter. I received yours of the 23rd inst. The boy, Donald Taylor, must quit on the 30th, and I have given him notice accordingly. The parochial board, of which you are a representative, is bound meanwhile to make provision. Yours, A. Matheson. So this poor lad, and I don't know just from this entry how old he was, but they talk about him as a boy. So I'm guessing probably under 14. It goes on to say the Inspector of Poor was instructed to put himself in communication with the Inspector of Poor at the parish liable for the maintenance of the said boy Donald Taylor, supposed to be Kilmuir, Argyllshire. So there was a requirement that they were looking to who was responsible for him to see if they would take on the responsibility. And also for the maintenance of a brother of his, John Taylor, both now in Dornoch without a guardian or without means of support, with a view to the pupil boys being placed under the care of their legal guardians or otherwise provided for. So they're trying to work out who's going to take responsibility for these children. The inspector explained further with reference to the boy Donald Taylor that on the 16th of November last he received an application from Mr. Alexander Matheson Taylor for an outfit of clothing for this boy, who had come the previous evening for shelter to his house with nothing but a cotton shirt on. That before granting such, he consulted the chairman of the board, when they resolved to call on Mrs. Neil Taylor, the Free Church manse, the supposed guardian of the boy, with a view to getting delivery of the boy's clothes, and to so save the parish the expense of an outfit. Mrs. Taylor, however, declined to give up the boy's clothing, and the inspector therefore had no alternative but to furnish him with an outfit at a cost of 22 6, which is now rendered for the same. So it's a classic story, but it's just so kind of emotive to read that this boy has turned up seeking shelter at the door with nothing but a cotton shirt, and rather than just give him clothes, they have said, well, we're going to go around, we're going to see who'll pay for it, we're going to see if your family will give you anything, we're going to try and get the payment first. And even now, when they have given him something, they're saying, okay, you've got it now, but we still want paid for it because we shouldn't have had to buy it in the first place. But poor relief records can give a great insight into the lives of everyday people in Dornoch in the 18 and 1900s. We can populate those streets, those buildings that we've been talking about so far, the cathedral, the development of the town. We can populate those buildings and streets with people when we start to look at records like this. And Dornoch, like the rest of Scotland, was a completely changing place in the 1800s. The cathedral had been extensively renovated by the divisive figure of the Countess of Sutherland. Building programmes were underway across the country for things like jails, schools, courthouses. So the physical landscape is changing. And cholera had struck the Highlands, with serious outbreaks in the 1830s and the 1840s, taking many lives. And again, I've spoken about this before, particularly with regard to Inverness. But it's interesting to look at the OS name books, which include various references to these events, including bits of graveyards being made over to be cholera burials. But Dornoch, I think, is unusual, and someone can correct me if they know loads of other examples, but I think Dornoch is quite unusual in having a distinct separate area marked on the map as cholera burial ground, AD 1832. But the late 19th into the 20th century, I've talked so far about some pretty hard-going things around battles, around illness and poverty. But as we come from the 19th into the 20th century, new horizons and possibilities started to open up for Dornoch, just as we saw when we looked at Tain, at Nairn and various other places. Tourism starts to be a possibility, and the age of the train is starting to open up the country to all sorts of potential events, potential people who could come. In Dornoch, substantial hotels are starting to be opened, and golf, which had already been played at Dornoch for some centuries, starts to become a really important part of the town's landscape. The town's story from the 1870s onwards includes golf at its heart. Have a listen to this extract from Ambala. The first 3 golf links in Scotland of which there is written record are 1552 St Andrews, 1593 Leith, 1616 Dornoch. It was in 1877 that the Dornoch Golf Club was founded as the successor to the Sutherland Golfing Society, whose members played at Dornoch and Golspie. The course was then only 9 holes long. The annual subscription to the club was 2 6, and the annual income was £3 18 shillings and sixpence. But changes were in store. The great Tom Morris came up from St Andrews and laid out 9 proper golf holes. 3 years later, another 9 holes were added, and the fame of the Dornoch course started to spread, even across the Atlantic to America. About the turn of the century, the great Sandy Herd first played with the new rubber cord ball, and out of fashion went the old gutty. John Sutherland, the club's secretary, who guided the fortunes of the club for over 50 years, and his committee, had to remodel the course as a result of the faster ball, and Dornoch became for a time the 5th longest course in Britain. In 1906, through the influence of Duchess Millicent of Sutherland, the club was granted the Royal Charter by King Edward VII, and Royal Dornoch Golf Club was born. And just reading that reminds me when I very first started with the Archive Service 10 years ago, John Sutherland, the club secretary, was, I think, either my first or one of my first inquiries to look into the story of John Sutherland and what he had contributed to national and international story of golf. Just brought that memory back when I looked at it. But what I can do with something like that, which I come across a reference to, is then go back into the Borough minutes to see evidence of those events of 1877. And sure enough, when I looked in the Borough minutes, I see evidence of a meeting being called to have laid before them an application addressed by Mr. Alexander McHardy, Dornoch's secretary to the Sutherland Golfing Society, asking if they can use Dornoch Links as a golf course. Interesting that the Borough Council say, yes, you can use it, but we retain the right to say no at any point that we decide to. We see a lot of that in Borough minutes. But yeah, we can see that use of the links. The link, incidentally, the golf course is often on golf links, the place that links the sea and the land. So we have golf starting to play a part. There's also a curling club at Dornoch formed around the same time, and it would only be another 20 years or so before the Dornoch Light Railway would come into existence, a branch line linking Dornoch to the main Inverness to Thurso route, increasing access both to and from the borough. And again, I went into the minutes to have a look for a reference to this, and it is an utterly boring one line that says the Dornoch Light Railway opened today in 1902. We hold various items relating to the Dornoch Light Railway, both in the Highland Archive Centre and also in Nucleus, because of course it joined onto that Thurso line, and various references within Ambala as well. As we come into the 20th century, that century is of course dominated by 2 world wars, and in these Dornoch suffered as much as every other community in the country, the loss of lives and the absolute upheaval of normal life, normality, routine, everything that had been before the war broke out. I'm not going to go into that here. I have looked several times at the impact of the First and Second World War, and I'm entirely sure I will do so again. But I'm going to look instead at another major subject, which I haven't referenced much, but which really came to a new state of play in the 20th century and is a subject really important to Dornoch's history, which is education. We hold both official and unofficial records of education in the borough and in the parish of Dornoch, logbooks and admission registers, as well as written memories and commemorative booklets. And I'm going to read from one of the latter, a commemorative booklet produced to mark the opening of Dornoch Academy by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 1963. It's quite a long extract, but it records a huge amount of information in it. History of education in Dornoch. In places, the historical record is incomplete, and these gaps were caused by the decline of the Celtic Church, the Norse invasions, the burning of the Roman Catholic Cathedral, and the Reformation. The earliest recorded ecclesiastical foundation is that of St Finbar and School Hill at around 564 AD, which incorporated a college for the youth of the community where they were taught Latin and Greek. Education in Dornoch remained for some time in the hands of the Celtic Church, but by 1222 the church in Dornoch was Roman Catholic, and the constitution of the cathedral, which was in accordance with the practice of the Roman Catholic Church, included a cathedral school. There may have also been an additional school at the Franciscan monastery situated on the site of the present Free Church. The cathedral school was the dominant partner until the cathedral was burnt by the Mackays of Strathnaver in 1567, by which time Protestantism was gaining ground. A new school was established in the townhouse at the Market Cross in the High Street, where it remained until 1589, when it was removed to the castle owing to the dilapidated state of the townhouse. In 1628, Dornoch became a royal borough, and it would appear that a new townhouse was built, which again accommodated the school until 1730, when the townhouse again fell into disrepair. The school was housed temporarily in the cathedral, but by 1738, had returned to the townhouse rebuilt by the Earl of Sutherland. During the 17th and early 18th centuries, interest in education was so widespread that 3 schools flourished in the borough, and an Act of Ratification in 1641 proves the existence of a grammar school, the master of which was paid 200 marks a year. There was also an English school, conducted by a mistress who was paid 6 shillings Scots per quarter for each pupil. By the beginning of the 18th century, largely due to the Jacobite rebellion, the borough was in a state of disrepair. The cathedral was crumbling, the castle uninhabitable, and the townhouse a ruin. It is uncertain where in the midst of this desolation the new schoolhouse was erected. The presbytery received a bitter complaint in 1810 that the borough school was inadequate for its purpose, and in the winter of that year other accommodation was found by renting for a time the property of a poor widow, unable to render it comfortable, so that masters and scholars suffered in their health in it. Between 1810 and 1815, vast improvements were made in the town, and plans were prepared for the erection of a new and proper schoolroom. These plans were never used, as accommodation was made available in the new wing of the castle, renovated by the Marchioness of Stafford. School was held on the first floor of the modern house, which had been erected between the tower and the original kitchen, and access was by a stone staircase outside the east gate. The New Statistical Account of Scotland, published in 1845, states that there were then 3 schools in Dornoch: parish school, a female school by the SSPCK, and another female school without salary, where the teacher depended on fees. The Free Church founded its own school in the building, which is now the Free Church Hall. The Free Church School was amalgamated in 1857 with the parish school on School Hill, and in 1884 the SSPCK school also joined the parish school. It goes on to detail various other amalgamations, but the main thing that happens is that the School Hill establishment remained in use until 1913, when the school transferred to a site at the west end of the borough overlooking the Dornoch Firth. The new academy was opened by Lord Kennedy on the 7th of January 1913, and 50 years later, on the 25th of September, a new secondary school was opened by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The old building, which now houses the primary department, stands side by side with the new, and together they constitute the present Dornoch Academy. The records of education in Dornoch may not be complete, but the tradition of over 1,000 years of education continues unbroken here, which is quite extraordinary. And that brings us pretty much up to date, 1963. The cathedral still stands, the golf course remains, the academy still exists, and the streets and place names continue to bear witness to events that have happened over those centuries. The railway does not still exist, it closed in the 60s. But the Dornoch Firth Bridge opened in the 1990s, transforming the way that Sutherland was connected to Ross and Cromarty. So those changes continue to happen and places continue to go through ups and downs. But I hope you have enjoyed finding out a little bit more about Dornoch. Please do go and have a look at History Link's website, and if you're in and around the area, do go in to visit History Links. Do come in to visit us and have a look at some of the records as well. But I hope that that's opened your eyes to some of the things that have happened in Dornoch over the past hundreds of years. A reminder that next week I will be back looking at Ewan Bain's Angasog, a collection held in the Skye and Loch Archive Centre. But in the meantime, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then please do so. It's really very appreciated. Thank you.